Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a nuestra mesa. En el programa, yo me llamo Juan Gaitán, soy el curador de ZsONAMACO este año, la zona amarilla, y como curador me piden que organice una mesa de discusión, que es esta, para la cual he invitado de mi izquierda a mi derecha, su derecha hacia mi izquierda, Pablo León de la Barra, en el momento curador de la colección de arte latinoamericano en el Guggenheim, Naomi Beckwith, curadora en el MCA en Chicago, y Nikolaus Hirsch, que creo que todavía 39 días más, director del Schule en Frankfurt, y de ahí en adelante independiente como yo. Y soy el curador de la Bienal de Berlín, que inaugura el 29 de mayo de este año. Si tienen pensado, ¿me pueden escuchar o nos toca hablar un poco más duro? ¿Se oye bien? Más alto. Ok. ¿No será posible correr estos parlantes hacia allá un poco? No hubo reacción. En el programa hablan o dicen que vamos a hablar de posiciones curatoriales. Es generalmente de lo que se habla en estas discusiones, pero nos pareció más actual e interesante hablar de la relación entre la arquitectura y el arte en el presente. Entonces hemos renombrado este panel la arquitectura temporal y permanente en el arte contemporáneo, y explico un poco. Eventualmente tengo que anunciar que vamos a pasarnos a inglés. Espero que todos puedan seguirnos en ese idioma. Pero les voy a explicar el panel en español. En este momento hay una cantidad de movimientos en torno a la arquitectura con relación al arte contemporáneo y a los museos, que han entrado en una relación más o menos simbiótica, desde, por ejemplo, la invitación cada vez más frecuente a arquitectos a diseñar las exposiciones temporales, bienales, documentales, ese tipo de exposiciones, y también hasta la utilización de los museos, de la renovación de los edificios para financiarse, que es una cuestión un poco compleja, de la cual estaremos hablando también. Entonces he invitado de hecho, Nikolaus y Pablo, los dos son entrenados como arquitectos originalmente, y Naomi y yo como historiadores del arte. Entonces estamos viendo también esta problemática desde dos puntos de vista diferentes. So welcome all four of you. I just explained what we discussed earlier about architecture, its uses and abuses in contemporary art, and its relationship to contemporary exhibitions, temporal exhibitions, permanent exhibitions, and so on. So perhaps a good place to start, as we have all, in one way or another, had a relationship to a museum, is to see how the architecture of a museum is determining the way art is exhibited as a permanent space, and how increasingly, the museum is seen as an inadequate space, that it's a sense of inadequacy that cannot be resolved, in my opinion. It's almost an impulse, unprocessed impulse to react to any space in a museum as already bad for art. One should say, maybe put it that way. So maybe we start with Naomi, who is in the center of the table, and the hands in
Gracias a todos. And I'm sorry I do not speak Spanish. I don't know if, should I just talk in English or do we need to translate? English. Okay. Hey, thank you so very much. Thank you, Juan, for inviting me for this. I wanted to start not so much with maybe a thought or a thesis about the relationship between architecture and exhibitions right now, but maybe a little bit of an anecdote. And that is, I work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. It is a museum that is the sort of classic white cube. It was designed by a German architect named, Kleichus, I forget his first name, Richard Kleichus? Paul? Joseph, yes, Joseph Kleichus. And he won a sort of competition in the 90s to build this building in Chicago that was an homage to modernism. Chicago being, of course, one of the places that really ran with the idea of the sort of modern repetition of the grid, of a kind of effectless building, affectless building. But I was in Berlin recently, and I visited the Hamburger Bahnhof, which was designed by the exact same architect. And what was fascinating to me, what was fascinating to me about that experience is that he replicated the exact same affects and the exact same architectural features in Chicago as he did in Berlin. So the Hamburger Bahnhof was built, the museum itself was built after the MCA in Chicago, but Kleichus already had an idea that he would build a building that would do two things. One is replicate a train station. So what you get are these long corridors that are the galleries. They're long corridors with vaulted ceilings that are inadequate for showing art in many ways, but they are an homage to the history of the building. And the second thing is, all the rest of the galleries are perfect squares. Absolutely perfect squares, with white walls, with lighted ceilings, and then wood on the floor, wood, or in the case of Chicago, terrazzo. And then there are these architectural details like the rise on the stairs have the exact same design in Chicago and Berlin. The door handles are exactly the same. And what it began to show to me, first of all, I was incredibly scared. It was like walking into a ghost of a building. You go from one place to another, but you find yourself in the exact same situation all over again. But the second thing that it reminded me of was there was an idea, obviously, in the 90s, starting really in the 80s, that the only way to show art was in a space that had no character, right? That had no distinctive architectural feeling. And so often now it seems that artists are trying to push back against that. That they want some kind of quirk or detail or some sort of feature in a room that will give them something to respond to. It's a sort of physicality, I think, that that artists are asking to respond to, at least in my experience now at the museum. And one of the best examples, I think, I just had a conversation about this. There's a beautiful installation right now in the exhibition. Can you hear? By Leonor Antunes. And she's a woman who wanted to do the same. She came to Chicago. She wanted to respond to the architecture of the building. And part of her response was to dig into the ceiling. But our ceilings are 100% lights. It's just a light box. So there was no way to drill holes into the ceiling. So we have to devise an entirely new system by which we could make a plexi film over the lights and then drill into the ceiling. So we realized again that the space was designed to be its own sort of perfect space, its own immaterial space. But oftentimes that sort of search for immateriality and affectless begins to defeat the idea that one can play with the architecture altogether.
Maybe let's all have add something. Pablo, first.
Do you want me to do Spanish or English so we can do a bilingual Spanish? So, I work at the Guggenheim, and this is a recent job. I've been working there for the past 6 months. And as most of you know, the Guggenheim is known for its building. Building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1943, but not finished until 1959. And a building that's iconic of the institution, and which in a way became the paradigm of the building, of the museum as a building, no? the museum building as a symbol. You were saying that your museum was like a train, inspiring trains. Ours is like the parking lot, no? It's the spiral of the parking lot. So actually, it's a very difficult space. It's a very particular space also to install exhibitions. And even though we had an addition done almost like, I think almost 20 years ago, where we have extra space to proper, semi-proper gallery rooms, which still have strange geometries, where you can exhibit more art normally, you still have the presence of the spiral. The spiral works perfectly when you do more, let's say, classical exhibitions, chronological exhibitions, because they really give you an overview of the work you're seeing, the evolution of the artist. Even thinking, I mean, now as part of my research, I've been doing a lot of research on the history of the institution. For example, Tamayo, Rufino Tamayo, had his retrospective there in '79, and you could really see the evolution of his work throughout the years as you went up the ramps, or vice versa, you come down the spiral ramps, but also you're confronted to the other images. So already it's a very kind of cinematic way of seeing an exhibition, because you're not only seeing one work, you're seeing the work from the side, but you're seeing the works that you already saw, and you're seeing the works that you're going to see. So there's also always this thing about anticipation and presence. I think what's amazing about the museum and about the curators that work there is that they've been able to like use the architecture as a museum as a way also to rethink exhibitions. And I'm going to put just some examples, some recent examples. But for example, in the exhibition by Tino Segal, who I'm sure many of you know about Tino Segal. He produces invisible work, basically performance work, which people are not allowed to register, that exist only immaterially, but where you see an action or a performance taking place. And in this exhibition by Tino Segal, one as a public would walk up the ramp, the space would be empty, and you would be confronted with performers, which were the work of different ages, from childhood all the way to the top to adult age. And each one would confront you with different questions that would make you think about yourself, about your life, about your experience throughout the building. So I think that's also kind of an intelligent way of confronting the buildings. Other exhibitions have done totally the contrary. For example, Maurizio Cattelan's exhibition. Again, there was nothing in the walls, but a whole retrospective of Maurizio Cattelan's works hung from the center of the building through the spiral. So one would walk around the spiral and see these works hanging like a giant mobile with all works of Maurizio put together. So in a way, I think the big boy also anticipated the idea and the need of museums to have a spectacular exhibition space. I think also of the Turbine Hall at the Tate, where the museum produces this kind of blockbuster works that attract people to create a kind of an experience, a giant experience. No? I think of Olafur Eliasson's work at Tate Modern, where he replicated the experience of a sunrise or sunset, and people would go into the space to experience this. Or our very recent James Turrell exhibition, where the spiral disappeared and you could see only the lighting of the building. So in a way, this is kind of the contrary, no? Where the building has a lot of presence, and you have to think how to deal with the building.
I think I want to describe the institution where I work, because most of you might not know the space, and I would rather prefer to go back to the two terms that Juan was referring to, temporary versus permanent. I think that exhibition making and making spaces for exhibitions implies very much problem of time and or of timing. And I think whether you're a curator, an artist, or an architect, you create, so to speak, time zones, or even very asynchronic rhythms that actually create a situation where I think both curatorial practice, artistic practice, and also the practice of institutional architecture are in a constant battle in a way, or they negotiate, to put it in more diplomatic terms. They always negotiate the space and the space-time relation. And in that sense, you could certainly name a lot of interesting examples, bad examples, you could see the situation of the different time zones as a conflict, as a problem, but I tend to see it rather as a potential, as you also describe it to a certain way, also as sometimes a situation that creates a productive misunderstanding to a certain extent. Because I think to me it's a bit meaningless to make actually a claim for a space that is ideal for art practice, because you have to ask yourself for which art practice. And so in that sense, I think what's more interesting, if you really look into the relation between particular architectural models and the way you do exhibitions. And it's very clear that today some of the institutions that we know, like the Tate, it was just mentioned by Pablo, but also the MoMA and many others, they include more and more new formats that were not present for the pioneers of museum building and then also curating of the early 20th century. So I think there's a situation that's really interesting because there are more and more time-based formats now entering the museum. So it's not only just about exhibitions anymore. So I did, just to give one example of an institution that I was not responsible for, just for the research on that. We did for a book and for a project called European Kunsthalle, we did a research on 100 years Tate Britain. So not Tate Modern, but Tate Britain. And what was striking that not only did the institution expanded enormously, but I think what's more interesting that actually the proportion in between the programs changed a lot. They used to have around 1900, they used to have almost 90% exhibition space. There was a dedication to showing artwork. Whereas today they have not even 30% exhibition space because they're totally new formats like screenings, performances, education, symposia, etc. And I think this is, to me, at the heart of that relation between a kind of spatial envelope or shelter and the practice of creating an exhibition or an institution. Because to me, whatever we talk about, whether it's the Guggenheim or another institution, to me these are institutions that are permanently under construction.
Well, I mean, several things have been touched on, but I would pick out of these the issue of time and chronology, and something that Pablo raised that I find very interesting and important to bring up is that the Guggenheim in New York, the Frank Lloyd Wright building, opened the way for the idea of a museum that is used today, especially in modern and contemporary art. So an iconic building that in itself becomes the logo of the institution. As you know, the big Guggenheim Bilbao has the profile of that building as its logo. And so in a sense that you are immediately identifying this place from the outside. So, and it's only one view that you have of the building. The logo establishes one, or privileges one view of the building over all others. But also the spiral, and this idea of the spiraling up towards, you know, the highest point in art, it's a very traditional, now it's a very traditional way of looking at it. And the alternative is this museum that seems to make no sense temporally, spatially, because so it's adaptable to diachronic ways of looking at contemporary art, at modern art, and so on. And still we have these, in a way, competing situations. And then Nikolaus adds to this the problem of the media that we are working with today. It would be virtually impossible to have an exhibition of video works inside the Guggenheim, you know, how inside this, without going into a state of cathartic. But it's important for me to see that in these buildings you hold a certain, let's say, if not an ideology, at least a kind of teleological, you know, inclination towards, you know, how to look at art. So it begins here and it ends there. And we still have this problem, especially in architecture. So we're competing constantly with those architectures to deformulate the space, if one can say it that way. I don't know if this brings any thoughts in you, or if I should just keep on. No.
Well, there's one thing that comes to mind, and that is when you talk about the profile of the building as a logo, what you're talking about is a kind of, in today's parlance, a recognizable brand. So that the logo begins to represent the institution altogether. But I think that does sit quite differently from what happens inside the building. So there's a bit, I think, of a distinction of what's happening in the exterior, the profile, which becomes conflated with the brand, and the interior, which are the spaces by which then you have to create the kind of the spatial format for the exhibition. So Pablo, I think you're absolutely correct that what the spiral of the Guggenheim begins to force almost upon several exhibitions, or the ideal exhibition in that space is a chronological one. So it is about a certain movement in time, but the idea again of the white cube space inside of this building, whether it be iconic or not, was the asynchronic exhibition. So you have the choice of doing either a narrative-based exhibition, a chronological one, or even a purely formal one, should you want to. But what it doesn't begin to address, I think, and maybe I'm just complicating the conversation, is how a body moves through space, how a body moves through the narrative of an exhibition. And you can't sort of totally escape time in any way, and just personally, I'm more interested in either working with artists or creating exhibitions that's very much aware of the body in space or in time, and that you're still situated in a sort of social moment.
To me, this question of the iconic value, I think it's an interesting discussion today, because most institutions actually play with iconic meanings. But I'm not sure whether this inside-outside discussion, which is of course classic discussion in architecture, whether this is still a productive discussion. Also, because I think it seems to me as if, I'm trying to provoke a little bit on how to speculate. It seems to me as if you at the same time overrate and underrate architecture. Because I think this, to a certain extent, I believe in the capacity of artists and curators to somehow create whatever they want with this kind of building, the physical product, and I think even against or with the Guggenheim. Yeah, but I think it's probably also for the discussion not useful to just take the Guggenheim here, because this is probably one of the most iconic and extreme examples, and we also all know that it was maybe not really planned as a museum either. So same with the Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery in Berlin, which was planned as headquarters of Bacardi in Cuba. So, which could prove somehow that maybe you just need good architecture, and maybe you need good artists, and you need good curators, and something will happen. And what could happen is, I think, an understanding of a museal practice that maybe goes back a little bit to some of the pioneers of discussion on museums, like Alexander Dorner, who described the museum as a Kraftwerk, like a, what is in English, like a Kraftwerk, you all know, I guess what it means. So I think to me it's more about actually the practice, and I'm an architect, so I contradict myself a little bit, but is it really so important in architecture? Because I think the dichotomy that you raised in the beginning, between the permanent and the temporary, it's, of course, we all know that it's much more complicated. So these are two terms that build a kind of umbrella and starting point for a discussion, but we all know from our own practices that actually there are many, many different time levels that actually contradict permanent and temporary. So I would, for instance, argue that actually it's not the architecture that is permanent. Because the architecture is actually, if you look what's happening with the museum, there's constant building going on. What is permanent are actually artworks. So they produce values that are, you can't basically touch them. So there are preservation techniques involved that are much tougher than for any piece of architecture. So I think maybe it's just the other way around, that what you define as your curatorial practice produces more aspects of permanence, whereas the side of architecture that you treat with such a respect, that this is not permanent at all. Even the Guggenheim is maybe not permanent. If you look into the material, there are constant changes, of course, technological changes, maybe they change windows, etc. So they change things, materially speaking, that you would not be allowed to change in an artwork.
So, I mean, thinking about things that we're talking, one, the building as a symbol, and I'm trying also to think how to think these things also from Mexico, no? And I see also that we have, I mean, our museums have also followed, or tried to follow this path of the museum as a symbol, no? We have the Sumaya Museum, which is quite recognizable, no? We have the Jumex, who has the teeth, no? I like also, every time I'm here, I ask the taxi drivers what names they give to the buildings. No? And it took them a while to give me a good name. For example, for Sumaya, they would say the corset of Olga Berinsky, who was a bebe. We had her the trophy. But a taxi driver told me a very good one. The toilet of King Kong, which I really like. Another friend of our critic calls it the Taj Mahal of Mexico, no? which is kind of nice because it's dedicated to his wife, no? And it also is inspired by the idea of the spiral, no? But here I think the spiral goes beyond into becoming kind of a centrifugal force. And what would be interesting of this force is if it would produce new meanings, you know. So I think that sometimes, I mean, it's also a force that could push spaces and museums to produce new things. And this takes us to think about how, I mean, what kind of museum would we like now, no? What kind of museum and architecture would work for today. And again, I was thinking about my own experience with museums, and I think, for example, as a visitor to Tate Modern, having lived in London for a long time, and how the exhibitions there were always chronological because of how the rooms go from one room to another. So basically, they had to do chronological exhibitions. And you always see the work of the artist, and you're like, okay, he was very good in the 1930s, 1940s and 50s. He really developed his language. The 70s is okay. By the time you got to the 90s and 2000s, you were, my God, it was a terrible finale. You know, so it's a very bad way for exhibition endings and to tell narratives. So if we could also think of different ways to tell stories or to tell exhibitions. And again, thinking about temporality, I mean, I think about Julio Cortázar and Rayuela, no? A possibility of an exhibition of taking you from one place to another, bringing you back, which maybe also a spiral can give you that thing, no? When I was talking about how you see the past and see the future at the same time or simultaneously, no? And I think of another example, maybe also by Hirsch and the Neuron, who did the Tate, that the Young Museum in San Francisco, that I don't know if you've been there. But there's no transition from room to room, but the space is open to each other. And you can take decisions to go from an African section to an ethnographic, to historical, to contemporary, and one thing blends into another in a kind of more fluid way. So thinking about different ways in which this machine, which is a museum, could tell us the different stories that us as a society need to hear. And then going again back to time and exhibitions, which was kind of the topic, and us being curators at museums, the idea also of the exhibition being temporary architecture, no? And what we do and our practice being something that appears, that is in the museum for 4 months, and then disappears, you know, and almost many times leaving no trace, as there's no registering catalogs. Now things are changing because of blogging. I think blogging and internet brings this thing that you can see photographs of and history of the exhibition, but of many historical exhibitions, and it's very difficult to find register of how of how the works coexisted within the exhibition space, and what story were the different works telling together when they were in dialogue in the exhibition space. So it's another question that I like to this idea of temporality and to.
In a way, I think Pablo has answered your point. And I will say it to a note I made here on the side. I remember a discussion, I don't know if any of you have ever read it, a very fierce discussion between Nikolaus, who's a cultural theorist, and T.J. Clark, who's an art historian, and as a cultural theorist, Nikolaus is on the side of the spectator, and as an art historian, T.J. Clark is on the side of historical truth. And so you have this discussion where she's saying, you go from one work to another and you create your own narrative, and he's exasperated by this point. So it's hard to know which one you agree with. But what's interesting to me is that you have also, I'm sorry to bring this boring comparison again, but the Guggenheim in New York and the Guggenheim in Bilbao are the two examples of a museum that's on the side of historical truth and transparency, and another one which is on the side of obscurity or obscurantism in contemporary art. So the profiles reflect this in a way. You have the Guggenheim and this idea that wherever you stand, you can see the panorama of our history, of the world's modern, the maximum examples of modern art on display all the time. And in the other one, you just look at it and you're immediately at a loss because you wouldn't know where to begin to engage with such a structure, And then there's the Andrea Fraser performance, where famously she has her approach barely takes her past the entrance lobby, where she's absolutely adoring this building. Making love. I think we cannot both. She's making love to the building instead. So, in a sense, I think the architecture. So, of course, if I take the point of view of the cultural theorists, it is important, precisely for the reasons that Pablo is mentioning. You can or cannot make choices. It begins with that. It begins at that place, whether the architecture is allowing you. And for me, then I was thinking one of the most irritating moments in a museum is where I have to walk back to a room that I already saw. And I wonder why. We can go back to the same exhibition 5 times to see it, but we do not want to walk back the same room. We want to visit it in the same direction 5 or 6 times. Why is it a problem to walk back the same? It's a kind of, contravention of our impulse to go forward in art, and it's the impulse of the way art is told in most cases, right? And so maybe this is something that also reflects or is reflected through the architecture of exhibitions.
Yeah, it is, but there's a very simple answer, of course, to keep that question open, and because I guess every curator or every museum director will have his or her answer or statement to a certain reading of the collection or of every exhibitions. And I think in that respect, it's not a surprise that now there are a number of museums that are going to be built, like the M Plus in Hong Kong, that just have a free span, like this building actually. So it's a pretty boring, banal, and straightforward answer. Okay? So, but it's of course just an empty box. Yeah, it's a free space, and you basically need then another architect. This is the exhibition architect. So there's separation between the shell somehow and an interior architecture that might have a lifespan of, 3 years, 4 years, maybe as long as the director stays. So that's also another fantastic phenomenon, of course, is that if you look into the rhythms of museum architecture, then this is highly connected to the egos and the theories and approaches of museum directors and decorators, which I think is you can criticize that because, of course, they blow out loads of money, taxpayers' money or donors' money, but I think there are good reasons for renegotiating and questioning the way how art history is described, or the history or the presentation of collections.
I'm glad you came around to what I said, which is there is an exterior architecture, and then there are interior structures. I knew you were coming around. But it's true, I think more and more what we're talking about isn't so much the building itself, the edifice, but what we're talking about is the architecture of an exhibition. We're talking about making shows more so than making buildings. And I think we can come back around to that. But just to respond immediately to your point about the building interior, exterior, sort of responding to the director's and the curator's vision, I don't know if that's such a bad thing. Yeah, I mean, except for there was a sort of financial criticism. No, I think it's a wonderful thing. There's the Institution of Beals in Rotterdam that changes directors every 3 to 6 years. And so the idea is that there's always a new narrative that can be said or told about art in its sort of contemporary time. And I don't, I mean, I know that you just said you didn't disagree with this, but I do agree that everyone comes with their own structures, and that we understand as art historians that these structures are going to shift according to perspective.
To give you another example, actually, for the way how actually the physical structure and the curatorial structure, how that can interfere. Because we were talking now about really signature buildings like the Guggenheim and other examples. If you look at the Tate Britain, that's a really interesting example because it's a building that is incredibly complex. So there are many different historic layers, and they actually appoint architects not just once, but for the next 30 years. So there might be actually 10 or 20 projects that Caruso St. John in that case will do in the next decades. So for them it's actually a long-term project. So they might actually maybe survive the director.
Well, maybe to also only to point out a local example. 2 years ago they opened the new redone Museo Tamayo. People's reaction was to go in and come out saying we don't see the changes. And this was interesting to me because it immediately meant that people were expecting to go into a building that had not changed in the outside at all. It was evident, we had all seen it, you know, in the different stages of its reconstruction. But expecting you go in like into a black, you know, some parallel dimension, and all of a sudden it would be a completely different structure. But of course there was a huge investment in this building, and the investment had to do with most likely updating it to what the requirements are, you know, for contemporary art now. So it was. I still wonder if it's absolutely necessary. Of course, we have to constantly change these buildings or adapt them or make them more whatever. But do they have to change formally? Is the question. And if they do, why?
Why should they change? Well, I think the example, I haven't seen this before and after of the Tamayo Museum. I've seen it before. But I think it's actually quite interesting to think about an architectural object and we have put a lot of energy to keep it, improve it, technically, and that you won't see any difference. So I think there's also a real beauty in that, and also a responsibility to keep a building that has a certain quality and not to open it up to all sorts of processes. I think this is a decision to be made and to be discussed, because of course we have to also consider these museum architectures. It's a decision whether you make a statement that this has a value on its own and should not be touched. If it's touched, you should not see the changes, or you have this eternal process, these expansions, like at Tate Britain, for instance. There's no answer. I think it depends totally on the specific example.
I'll continue analyzing local examples just to kind of ground it and land the conversation here. So yeah, for example, the Tamayo, I mean, it seems that you don't look at the changes. It's the same architect 40 years later doing Aztec brutalism. But actually, because the way you approach the Tamayo from the side, you first see the new building, and it's very confusing at the new addition, that there's this stair going up to the cafeteria. So now the entrance has become the entrance to the cafeteria. Then when you're inside, the space was thought, and it was built in '82, so it was thought for another kind of art, much more straightforward, painting and sculpture. And there were kind of, there was a kind of route that you would walk through the space, ending in the plaza, and then go inside the space. Now the new connection with the new space is totally different. The new space it's almost an open space where, it can be divided as you want it. Gives the museum more flexibility. It is also a very weird connection. And the connection in the inside with the old building, it's also very weird. You know, it's as if it doesn't, you can still see a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new. It's interesting. If you compare it to the same building to another building that Teodoro González de León did 30 years later, the MUAC in Ciudad Universitaria, it's the experience that you don't know where you're going. You know? There's one exhibition that then becomes another, you don't know where it ends, where the other goes. There's this experience of being lost in the labyrinth. For me, it reminds me, and I don't know if you know this project, but the Ragnis Danteo, which was built to be experienced as a divine comedy, where you would go from dark corridors and down to the Inferno, passing through this kind of labyrinthic space. No? I think again of, for example, Jumex, no? Which people call the Dientes de Tiburón, no? Shark Teeth. And it's a beautiful building, you know. I went there and I was so surprised. I was like, my God, it's so well done. It's so weird in Mexico to see a building so well finished, you know, where every time we finish things last minute, badly done. And I was like so surprised of the marble floors. You go upstairs and it's so much light. I mean, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. But then I think again, it's a building that could have been done 20 years ago. You know, that it's not. It's pure modernism. You know, it's a building over pilotis. It's open space. It's so trying to think also in Mexico how to think the museum, how to think the exhibition, and then I think of other examples which for me are fascinating. And for example, the archaeology museum, no? And that's a permanent example of architecture and almost of exhibitions. The displays have changed. I mean, there's been changes, and some have been modernized, some better than others. But still, you have this experience, this dramatic experience of the history of our Mexican race and our forefathers, and this dramatic history told with lights and shadows and reconstructions and copies. But then, if you go upstairs, you have the most amazing museum that almost nobody visits, and for me, that's a museum of ethnography. And that's like the amazing museum where we see the story of the cultures that are still alive in the country, the indigenous that were not conquered so much, or were not that colonized, or didn't mix so much to form our mestizo race, but combined also with contemporary works at the time, murals that were commissioned, that narrate and dialogue and break this time gap between old and new. And you have like amazing works by Matias Geritz, like a beautiful mural made of ropes. You have works by Luis Covarrubias, Miguel Covarrubias, Carlos Mérida, that are lost in time. You know, so I think there's also a thing that's interesting about these permanent museums that are also kind of stopped in time. You know, that are just to bring new.
What's fascinating to me is that two things. Going back to the idea of the interior architecture, I agree that Jumex feels a bit. It feels like classic modernism, that you're right, could have been built any time in the last 30 years. And I see it as a straight up homage to like Hirsch and Goldberg. I mean, those teeth are very much, it's not even Goldberg, but whatever, classics. Louis Kahn, exactly.
In Mexico, it's Juan Gorman, who was the translator of Le Corbusier to Mexico.
Exactly. So those things are there, but one thing that happens to me inside of the space of Jumex that I think is interesting is that, so there's one exhibition per floor, and when you come to the beginning of an exhibition, there's generally a wall right in front of your face. And so you have to make a decision whether or not to go left or right. And though oftentimes there's a chronology to the exhibitions, well, except for the permanent installation, the permanent collection installations, you have to make a decision as a viewer about how to negotiate it. And the second thing you have to do is turn around. So that's fascinating. You don't just go in a sort of a classic sort of clockwise fashion in one way. You literally, once you make that left or right decision, you almost go backwards. This, to me, is super fascinating. It's a way that seems to be built into the building, and the way that they're almost, I don't know if the curators have made this decision, but it's an unusual move. But what's fascinating too that can happen inside of these moments is that I love it when a museum can become more self-reflexive. I see this more in anthropology and archaeology museums in the space of the exhibition more so than the architecture. Though there's a beautiful anthropology museum again in Berlin, the Neues Museum, that is both reflecting on itself as an architectural space. It is a museum that is both modern, but also looking at a building in constant decay at the same time, and thinking about what that means to present history. And there's a beautiful moment even in the Anthropology Museum here, where in the ethnography section, of course you have the dioramas, the classic sort of human scale funny dioramas where people are having their everyday moment, they're cooking, they're trading, they're worshiping Jesus, whatever it is. But there's one moment in the museum where a woman, I forget what sort of indigenous group she's from, is looking at a display of her people, right? There's a beautiful, like, self-reflexive moment of understanding that the audience for this isn't just going to be the kind of ignorant tourist of a viewer, but sometimes the audience is the subject of the exhibition itself.
You bring, or you both bring up the Ethnography Museum here, and there's one of the ongoing debates in Berlin at the moment is around the Ethnography Museum there, which was built in the 1960s, or actually it was built before, but in the 1960s the building where it is now was done, and the architect, whose name is, was an amateur or an amateur of Mesoamerican archaeology. So he designed the building along with this room that has all the Mesoamerican collection, not all of it, but a pretty important selection of this Mesoamerican collection that he put into display in a way that cannot be moved. So some of them are actually bolted to the ground, and it's the irritant of the curators of the museum that they have this collection in storage that cannot come out because the room is so firmly placed. Then, now that the building is being abandoned because this is being moved to, I'll spare you the whole detail, but basically they're reconstructing or imitating the reconstruction of a Prussian palace where they will move the ethnography collection. They don't find it problematic at all, but what they did was then they have to leave this building from the 1960s, and the debate now apparently is whether the display of the collection is protected along with the building from the 1960s or not. So could you move the pieces that the architect seemingly designed the building for, and so on. But another thing that's quite fascinating about this building is that as you move through it, in the ethnography museum, you have the display of the 1960s done by the architect. Then in the 70s, there was someone else who did the South Seas. And there's a room with full-scale ships that were shipped from Polynesia, Malaysia. And they're on display there along with all these things. Quite, in my opinion, an amazing display. Takes 2 floors. Then you move into another room that was designed in the 80s. And, to second what you said, it gets worse and worse. And when you get to 2000s, you get to Africa. The African section was redone in the late 90s or early 2000s by a Brazilian, and the whole thing is painted black. And immediately you realize there's something totally wrong about how this thing has been displayed. And this perhaps explains how they find it so easy to move to Prussian palace or not. But for me, what's important about this museum is that as you move through it, and it does have quite a seamless parcours, you are also experiencing an anthology of display for formats, and you're also looking at how ethnographic objects are engaged with in different decades and the significant changes. So in the 60s and 70s, you feel the influence of this sort of experimental, phenomenological way of looking at art that disappeared in the 1980s, and which involved very simple things that are quite powerful, like using white sand to represent water, soil, grass, or sand on the display cases, and these things make it more. And then surprises, like, you know, an ethnographer standing in front of a tribe wearing a mask, things like this. You know, like you would not expect to see these things anymore. Now the tendency will be to emphasize, which is what happens in the Africa section, the image of these objects rather than their original context, and put them on display with spectacular lighting and in display cases that are totally sterilizing and so on. And this removes the object from the experience of the visitor. So, this is another, or it's more a response to what you were mentioning just now. And but maybe make one more comment and then open it up to the audience. Maybe there are questions or points to be made.
I think it's interesting that we now talk so much about anthropology, because it also seems to me that maybe there was a kind of overproduction of always the same types of museums and displays in the art world in the past 20 years. Like how many museums were built, how many museums we have seen. Maybe there is some kind of an exhaustion, for the good or the bad, I don't know. But it seems to me as if there's a wish or a necessity to reach out towards anthropology there, because this is, of course, when we look around us, there's a very strong discussion around that, and also the relation between anthropology and art, because I think these have been treated, like, for the past decades as fairly separate domains. And now there are several attempts to actually build some kind of relation and to put them in direct contact. And I think you can see this evolution in many areas, that there are now attempts to break down some of the walls between the systems that we call a museum of anthropology, museum of art, museum of design, etc. And the museum that I was just referring to in Hong Kong, they for instance has nothing to do with anthropology, but they were pretty much against the MoMA system, which is also a system of departments. So they actually dissolved what they try to do. I don't know whether they will be successful or not, but they will work without departments. And this, I think, goes back, of course, to some of the discussions that we are all familiar with that happened in the 60s and 70s. I think that when you think about cultural institutions as they were imagined by Cedric Price, Van Palace, or which later influenced certainly the Centre Pompidou, I think we are going back to that.
Can I be really selfish before we open it up to the audience? And maybe this is to the audience as well, just to bring it back to art specifically. There's a very controversial case about art and architecture that's an ongoing conversation in the US. And this is around the Alfred Barnes collection. Alfred Barnes was both a collector, a philanthropist, an inventor and chemist who became incredibly wealthy, and built a collection inside of his home that was always meant to both showcase art. Much of the art was modernists who hadn't yet been collected by institutions in the US, so there's a fair amount of Picasso and Matisse and so forth. He was one of the first collectors in the US to collect these artists. But secondly, he was incredibly interested in what we would call now anthropological objects. So he would travel around the world and gather functional things like bits of architecture, vases, keys, door handles, what have you. And he installed this in his house in an incredibly particular way. It was one man's vision to put, let's say, a Matisse mural next to, some sort of a vase from Western Africa. Now, Barnes left this collection and his home in a trust, and with the particular stipulation that the collection could never be changed inside of the house. Nothing could be moved. And the house would always become a kind of educational space as well. He left it in trust, in fact. This is another layer of complication. He left it in trust to a historically black university. So normally one would set up an estate with your lawyers, your friends, your family members, and they would take care of this. But he very specifically made the decision to give this to an African-American institution. That trust was recently broken as in it's fallen apart. The museum then established a new trust, a new board of directors, and they built a new museum inside of Philadelphia. I'm sorry, I should say that the original house is right outside in the suburbs of Philadelphia. But now there's a new museum, a new Barnes collection inside of Philadelphia. And this was a massive, massive, massive fight in the city because, again, the man who created the collection never wanted this to move or change. He never wanted anything changed. But the concession for the new trust was to recreate the house exactly as is inside of a new edifice. Again, the edifice itself is one thing. It's, a new kind of icon in Philadelphia. But inside, each of the galleries are an exact replica of the building outside of Philadelphia. So there's this, again, strange ghosting going on that is a fight that continues to this day, both about what intellectual property, about the wishes of a auteur in many ways, and also what does it mean to replicate something? What kind of authenticity is inside of that kind of architectural formation? Anyway, I just throw that out there before.
Just some last thoughts before we open it up. It's interesting that we're thinking so much about ethnography and anthropology today, and I think it also has to do because never as a culture we have produced so many museums. Today we're producing a lot of art. There's an art economy that supports the purchasing of these objects. They're entering into collections. So I think it makes us think what will become about these objects, what will happen with them. And it takes me back to the idea of the collection as the basis of a museum. And the collection, again, not as a frozen thing, not as something to be kept in a refrigerator, but maybe as Pedro Reyes, a friend of ours, an artist, says, it's an oven. It's a place where we can bake ideas. And this brings me back also to the thought of another dear friend of ours, Clementine Delis, in the Frankfurt Museum of World Culture, where she has all this anthropological collection, but she uses it as a toolbox to rethink today, and to invite contemporary artists to think with the collection. So in this way, I see the collection as the bank of the museum, as where its values are kept. But it's a bank not only about economic value, but about the ideas values, and how these ideas can be brought back and how can we reactivate them as them not to be frozen, as for example, the example of the house that you said today.
Well, we have more to say, but maybe it's time for... Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Gerald. I would like to ask a simple question, which I was discussing with some people who came to exhibition members. They are talking about that now they are seeing in some places that many artists are international artists, more than local artists, that even if they are from Mexico, Brazil, or any Miami or any other place, the most important is that they are creating good art and good value in the art. And this is a question related to the museums that it's very well known that international artists are very welcome in some museums because they come from China or from Malaysia or whatever it comes, and that attracts to the people. What do you think about the international museums and the importance of good art at these moments? Thank you very much.
No, I'm going to let you start. You have the international franchise.
I think we cannot. I think that we cannot judge art in value of good or bad, and in value of nationality. I think if something we have learned from artists, and here art has been at the forefront, is in this attempt of this denationalization of culture. That the culture is not a fixed thing, and that nationality traits are always in flux. And I think that the artists are those that create bridges of connections, of thoughts that cross the bridges between cultures, you know? And that art is not a competition of, it's not Miss Universe and it's not the World Cup where we are representing each other, but that it goes beyond and it has another function.
I would absolutely agree with that. And there's a part of me that's an idealist, that of course, which leads me to agree with that statement. Though I would also add that I believe it's important to always be sensitive to context, exactly, to the local and the context. Though you are absolutely correct, that is constantly changing. But you still should understand how certain, one, at least in the best case scenario, should always be sensitive to the kinds of forms and information that travel and how it's interpreted in the local, and how exactly can translate it and what forms become possible in that local moment because of that translation.
Everything has to be said. But maybe it's something, because I guess we all know this discussion, because I guess we are all in our institutional practices, we are confronted with that question. So I, for instance, I'm the director of an art school where we don't speak German. More than 70% of the students are foreigners, so everything is in English. It's not an ideological choice, pure pragmatism. And then, of course, there's a critique, well, it should be much more local, where are the Germans? I cannot make they didn't get, they were not successful in the application, that's all. And, but that's a bit provocative, I know that. But, you know, the question of the local, it's, of course, the local is also a construction. It's an ideology. So what is local? Who are the locals? Are we talking about the next neighborhood or the city, or who's included, who's excluded? So I think that you somehow see in the local, the notion of the local, you see the same patterns as in the notion of the international. So it's going back and forth constantly. You know, I've also as an architect, I confronted a situation actually for a museum building in Cologne, where people in Cologne told me, hey, you're not from Cologne, you can't work here. Yeah. And you can actually scale it down and say, okay, there's a river in Frankfurt, I live on the north of the river, so therefore I should not have a say on the south of the river, or next street, or you know, where does it begin, where does it end? So in that sense, I would argue for a much more dynamic model in a way, which I think could be very fruitful also for Mexico City, for this country also, because of course all the countries that we know, they are in a constant debate about what is this nation, this state, and maybe more international voices are actually quite beneficial. And if I may argue, maybe a last comment to that, because we were talking a lot about museums, and I think one of the crucial, somehow the basis of actually being able to collect artworks is actually is education also, is the educational system. So in that sense, I think it's very important to actually maybe denationalize a little bit the art education.
I mean, just to maybe insist on something that has been implied, the category is very obscure, international art, but in part it's the replacement of other categories. We're always battling against a category, but no one would say I'm an international artist or it's more applied. So in the sense, it's more applied to as a statement against the many different systems that perpetuate a certain kind of localness in the art scene and the detachment, let's say, from a very localized point of view in favor of having an exchange with the outside. So I think in a very practical way and also maybe even political way, saying international art is saying we are not enclosing ourselves in our place and in our own cultural values and so on. But at the same time, all artists or practitioners still have, unfortunately, a nationality to contend with, and maybe that's another issue that has to be addressed.
Si te presentas nada más y dices lo que haces.
Hola, me llamo Alvarado, estudié comunicación y tengo un máster en estética. ¿Puedo hacer la pregunta en español, no? Mencionaron un cierto tipo de negociación. De acuerdo a su experiencia, ¿cuál sería ese punto intermedio entre la arquitectura del museo como marca tal cual y las necesidades y la naturaleza de la colección del museo?
The question was, what is the negotiating ground of the relationship between the desire for an iconic building, if I am interpreting you correctly, and the requirements of the collection? What art requires and what the architects want.
The proper architect. That's amazing.
Well, I could play all sorts of roles. I think it goes back to what you said about the split between exterior and interior. I think that would be a simple solution how you will negotiate. That you tell the architect, or you launch a next kind of competition, and you invite typical suspects, and then you tell them, okay, let's have an iconic building, but don't go too far. The interior is sacred. Don't touch it. I think that would be one solution. But I think what's probably necessary is to have directors and a team that actually develops, ideally with architects, a certain strategy. And because this might eventually be more promising, more interesting, because maybe there's also an end to what you call iconic, because I think there's so many iconic museum buildings. Museums became a bit what for the 19th century were churches, like the most interesting things to do for an architect, because it's a great job actually. You have very little windows, for instance. You're actually quite free in terms of design. Whereas with an office building, all these office workers, they want light. Terrible. So that this defines certain parameters in the design. So it restricts you as an architect. And this is, of course, churches, I think, that they became slightly less sexy as a kind of, in terms of their cultural value. I don't want to offend anybody here, but it's, there are not so many iconic churches anymore. There have been some in the 20th century, but I guess this has been replaced by museum buildings. So if historians would like to describe actually what happened in terms of the building, like civilization, like what had been built around the turn of the century, I think they would probably be looking pretty much into museum buildings. But they might also understand or describe it as something that was a kind of golden age, but the golden age very often is kind of inflation of it's too much of something. So maybe they would describe and look more into the problems, like, okay, there was no social housing, strange. This was the big topic. There was no social housing, yeah? And this was a big topic for modernism, and suddenly it disappeared. Strange.
It's a symbol of decadence.
It's a symbol of decadence
that we've moved
into temples
stadiums.
And then into stadiums, but no social housing and museums. Every curator complains about the museum that they have to curate in. I don't know if you guys have said anything different, but no matter what you have, if you have a building that's iconic inside and out, or if you have the white cube, everyone goes, I hate this. I can't deal with this corner. I can't deal with this floor. Everybody says this, every generation. I'm interested, though, in some certain architects who make absolutely strict restrictions on the building. So I'm I'm back in the States, but I'm thinking about the new Perez Art Museum. Perez Art Museum in Miami, where all the walls are concrete. So if the wall is concrete, even as a curator, you're not going to try to hang stuff as often as you normally would. There is a museum in St. Louis, the Pulitzer Art Museum, that is dedicated to a permanent collection. It's built by Tadao Ando, and he had a very specific process of casting concrete bit by bit and building up the entire building almost like a Lego set, bit by bit. And if anything went wrong, they had to tear it down and start all over. And the Pulitzer paid for this over and over again. But you can't touch his walls. You can't build any new walls. You can't drill into the walls, which means that essentially, you can't drill into any walls that haven't been designed for drilling. So essentially, the curators can't put paintings in certain places. And most of their exhibitions are sculpture, even though there's painting in the permanent collection. So there are oftentimes real struggles between the architecture and the collection and the vision of the curators, even if it's not just about practical stuff like lighting, but it's really about what can you do with the surface of things.
I think you're totally right, but with every good and right example, there are of course counter examples. Like when you think about concrete, you might think about the museum by Peter Zumthor in Bregenz, where you can actually they actually use the walls. They're concrete, but it's very detailed. They have fantastic craftsmen, so they know how to do it. Yeah. And so that even with concrete, there are solutions. So I think it's not the fault of the material. Maybe blame the architect and the director of the institution.
Only to put a little grain of salt into this, great relationship between architects and museums. The most often forgotten elements in a museum design, famously, are bathrooms and storage. To the point where the architects get irritated when they have to add bathrooms and storage to the buildings. So what kind of restrictions does that put?
I think you blame the wrong people because they are. No, this is.
The problem is that no women on the committees.
Okay, we need more women on committees. No, but honestly, there is something like a brief. And there's every architect before he or she starts designing. It's a brief, and there's square meters. There are all the functions in that. So basically, you should blame a piece of paper where everything is described. And this is usually done by museum experts. So I think architects don't forget toilets. This is not. It was a wrong brief, maybe. How do you do that?
That's happening in my building.
All
the toilets are on one level, all the bathrooms.
Yeah, but someone should have told the architect it's wrong.
Someone should have told the architect that when they look at a building, they might add things that the brief forgot to mention. Maybe.
No, and maybe as a way of closing, also that I don't see anything wrong with the building being a symbol. That actually it's a good thing if it attracts people, if it helps people get into the museum. And again, that the problem is more about the content and how we put inside and how we facilitate the public to read and to understand what we're saying. So actually, it's great that the Sumaya is this shiny building, and that all these people went to take photographs and selfies outside them, and next them come inside. And especially in that moment in Mexico's history when it was built, and the people were depressed about what was happening in the country. So suddenly this kind of silver trophy came out, this jewel came out, but then it's again about how we give understanding to what's inside, how we guide the people in creating also their own narratives, their own pathways. So I think that's much more important also.
Maybe one more question.
Okay. Hello, my name is Diego, and I'm doing a degree in history. My question is, with all the current attention is being given to the museum's architecture, do you think there was a risk that the museum becomes so, like, wait a second. do you think that the museum is there the risk that the museum becomes more important, for more attracting for the viewers as for the museum than instead of the works of art? For example, I think about the Guggenheim, not only New York but also Bilbao and soon Abu Dhabi. And there was a lot of people who go to these museums only because of the building, and they really do not care about the work, the art inside. So how do you deal with it? How do you deal with people who actually do not want to see the art but the museum instead?
That's a very big question, Leo. Leo, no? Leo. Diego, sorry. I can't hear. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, what you're bringing up some very serious economic questions, essentially, and there are two levels of economies that we haven't really discussed, and these are the kind of classic theories of how architecture is that thing which is so attached to economic development of a place, right? So the wealthier a place becomes, the more you're going to start seeing these iconic buildings prop up and spring up everywhere. And this isn't just about museums, but museums become implicated in that idea of the architectural wealth of a city, a municipality, what have you. But secondly, I think there are different sort of pressures being put on museums now that have been, I don't know if it's altogether different, but there are periods where, and I would say we're in a period right now where essentially oftentimes municipalities and cities are asking museums to become part of a kind of tourist industry. I mean, that is much of the case, but more and more so, that kind of pressure on sort of numbers. And even now in my museum, when we put together a proposal for funding, we will say, we will attract this many visitors to Chicago for the exhibition, and it becomes part of the economic health of the city. For me, personally, it's a bit scary, but these are the kind of realities that we sort of deal with in the institution. In terms of our particular curatorial practice, I don't know if it's so much a fear of the person who only wants to see the building. It's more of an awareness of how you have to address multiple audiences. So on the one hand, you have the specialists, our colleagues, who come to the exhibition, and then you go down to the children, literally, or the people who may just wander into the building because it's something nice to do on a Saturday afternoon, or because it's shiny and it makes them feel happy or what. You know, I mean, that's what's interesting about the Sumaya is not only is it a very kind of optimistic building, but it's free, so you can come in, right? So what you need then is a kind of educational and an interpretive sort of practice that has to address all those multiple levels of understanding of contemporary art.
I think this is a really serious question, and also what you describe, a real struggle for everybody today, because the pressure is increasing. Like what you named, or what you call attraction. I think this is a real struggle, and I think it's a real problem in a way. And I'm not sure whether this is actually the right approach. So I know that many colleagues of mine who really suffer a lot because it comes with a lot of restrictions in a way in your work, because you need to actually explain what you do, what you curate, the exhibitions, a bit like you described, Naomi, that you would attract so-and-so number of people, etc. And I think at the end, I think we are somehow forced to argue for a notion of culture and art that is useful to society. And I think this usefulness, I think this is also kind of a trap. Because it's very instrumental in a way. And you could, if you look into, for instance, the Tate model, I think this is a perfect example. It has been started as a project during New Labour. It's a New Labour project, and it perfectly fulfills all the assumptions of Tony Blair. Post Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blairian model. So I've done research with students on that, and it's amazing how the Tate model achieved to reflect the mosaic of the whole society. So they're blind visitors, handicapped, but it's a mirror of the society. So the word it's not anymore elitist, old problem that was attached somehow to museums. It reflects, but there's an aim to reflect the society, to be useful in society. To the end that a wonderful colleague of mine from the AA, Architecture Association in London, Mark Cousins, wonderful his professor, he was arguing for a children-free day at Cape Modern. At least I blame someone else.
Tourist-free days.
I guess again it's different publics. For example, at the museum we have people that come because they want to have the experience of the building. You have also architects that want to see the building. You have people that want to see the Kandinskis that are interested in 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. You have people that come to have the contemporary experience, to see the exhibition that's on at the Rotunda. So yes, you have also multiple contents and multiple publics. So it's also about trying to balance. The museum does live of its entrances, the entrance fees which are expensive for the normal public. Of course, there's discounts for students and for different publics. But it's also a different model than the American model, which is different from let's say the Mexican government, where most of the culture until very recently has been subsidized by the government. So.
Just 2 points in closing. One is there's the just recent. I just thought maybe the museum takes the pressure off having to understand the act, so you can actually go. You can go to see the building, and you don't have to worry if you get what's going on inside. But the other thing is, there's also the tragic case of the Louvre, the most visited museum in the world, where the sweat and condensed air in the museum is constantly ruining the treasures that are held inside the museum. So they have one of the most expensive and numerous conservation, or the most numerous conservation department, because they have to conserve works basically every year. Every work has to be worked on. So the way so many people go through it. But anyway, I think we'll stop here. It's been great to have you on this table. Thank you. And thank you for attending. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And that's that. Thanks.